The peat bog on the Orkney mainland gives up its secrets reluctantly. In 2009, during a routine survey near the Ring of Brodgar, ground-penetrating radar flagged an anomaly, a shape too dense, too deliberate for natural geology. The excavation that followed unearthed not a Viking hoard or a forgotten longhouse, but a single, deviant burial. The skeleton belonged to a young woman, dated to the late 9th century. She was laid face down, a pagan practice sometimes used to contain the restless dead, and pinned with heavy stones. Forensic analysis of her bones revealed a life of hardship, healed fractures in her ribs and evidence of severe malnutrition during her formative years. But it was the isotope analysis of her tooth enamel, conducted at the University of Aberdeen, that turned a local mystery into a historical enigma. This woman was not from Orkney. She wasn't Scottish or even Norse. She was born and raised hundreds of miles away in the heartland of the Frankish Empire. Buried with her was a single, exquisite silver brooch of Carolingian design, deliberately broken in two. The act was symbolic, a ritual killing of an object tied to its owner's identity. She was a high-status captive, brought to this remote Norse outpost, where her life ended in a way that archaeologists are still debating. She was not merely killed. She was curated for the cold earth, her burial a final, macabre statement. What Viking warlords demanded of their captives was more than labor, more than ransom. It was a systematic dismantling of the self, a process that left its traces not in texts, but in the tortured chemistry of bone and the ritualized grammar of the grave. This Orcadian grave is not an outlier. It is a single data point in a grim constellation stretching across the entire Viking world. From the mass graves of Repton in England, containing the bones of the great heathen army and their female captives, to the eerie bog bodies of Jutland, the earth holds the unwritten history of the vanquished. Sagas and chronicles, penned by victors or distant observers, speak of thralls and bondwomen in sterile terms. They are listed as property, footnotes in the grand narrative of conquest and settlement. But the forensic evidence tells a far darker story. It speaks of a calculated process, a form of psychological warfare waged not on the battlefield, but in the halls and holding pens of Viking warlords. The true demand was not for obedience, but for a terrifying transformation. A captive was to be unmade, their identity fractured, their connection to their past, their family, their faith, their very name, methodically severed. This wasn't random brutality born of the chaos of a raid. It was a cold, often ritualized procedure designed to turn a person into a thing, an asset whose ultimate value lay in their utter subjugation. The goal was to create a walking effigy of defeat, a human symbol of Norse dominance whose continued existence was a constant warning to their enemies. The process was so effective that its echoes linger in law codes, in runic inscriptions, and in the disturbed soil of forgotten graves, waiting to be unearthed. To understand the demand, you must first understand the economy that fueled it. Between the years 793 and 1066, the longship was not merely a vessel of war. It was the engine of a vast, continent-spanning trade in human lives. Major hubs like Dublin, or Difflin to the Norse, became some of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Here, human cargo from Ireland, Anglo-Saxon England, Francia, and the Slavic East was sorted, appraised, and sold. An able-bodied man might be destined for labor in the new Norse settlements of Iceland. A skilled artisan might be kept to work in a warlord's personal workshop in Birka. But high-status captives, especially women, occupied a unique and precarious position in this brutal marketplace. A captured abbess, a noble daughter, or a princess was an asset of immense political and symbolic weight. Ransoming her back to her people was one option, but often a less profitable one. A far greater return could be achieved by keeping her. Her presence in a Norse longhouse was a living trophy, a constant, tangible reminder of her family's humiliation and her captor's power. She was a piece of political theater, and her performance had only just begun. The initial terror of the raid was merely the prologue. The real horror was methodical, domestic, and designed to last a lifetime. This was the curated destruction of a soul, a process that began the moment a captive was dragged onto the blood-slicked deck of a longship, leaving the smoking ruins of her world behind. The value of a noble captive was measured in honor, a currency as real as silver to the Viking mind. To seize the wife or daughter of a rival king was to seize his hamingja, his luck, his spiritual authority. This is why the treatment of these specific captives differed so starkly from that of common thralls. While a field hand was broken for compliance, a noblewoman was broken for display. The annals offer glimpses of this. The annals of Ulster record the capture of high-born Irish women, who then disappear from the native record entirely, their fates known only to their captors. The goal was not just to remove them from their society, but to absorb and nullify their status within the Norse one. This process of ritual degradation often began with a name. A woman named Eilif in the Anglo-Saxon court, a name resonant with history and lineage, would be given a course, often insulting Norse name, Homdi's island goddess, a cruel joke for a landlocked captive or fina fen-dweller. This linguistic violence was the first step in stripping away her identity. If you value historical inquiries that dig into the macabre soil of the past, subscribe to our channel. We follow the evidence where it leads, no matter how forbidden the destination. This renaming was more than an insult. It was a legal and spiritual rebinding, the first link in a chain that would drag a queen from her throne to a thrall's sleeping bench. The sagas, for all their heroism, are haunted by the ghosts of these captive women. In the Laxdæla saga, we meet Melkorka, an Irish princess captured and sold as a concubine in Iceland. She pretends to be mute to hide her noble birth, a detail that romanticizes a brutal reality. For most, there was no hiding. The sagas, composed 2 centuries or more after the events they describe, often gloss over the mechanics of this subjugation. They are propaganda, foundation myths for the Icelandic Commonwealth, and they soften the edges of their own grim origins. To find the truth, we must cross-reference these literary echoes with the cold, hard science of archaeology. The sagas might tell us that a captive was taken, but forensic anthropology can tell us how she lived and died afterward. Analysis of skeletal remains from Norse burial sites frequently reveals what is known as Harris lines, markers of arrested growth in bones, indicating periods of severe malnutrition or disease. When these lines appear on the skeleton of a woman buried in a high-status Norse grave but whose isotopes confirm a foreign origin, the story becomes clear. She was not a cherished Norse wife. She was a prized possession who had endured immense suffering, a life of deprivation that stood in stark contrast to the rich grave goods that sometimes accompanied her into the cold earth. The evidence is written in the very chemistry of the dead. A landmark 2018 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, led by researchers from the University of Copenhagen, examined dozens of burials from a 10th-century Norse cemetery in Denmark. By analyzing strontium isotopes in tooth enamel, which fixes in childhood and reflects the geology of where a person was raised, they created a map of origins. Over a third of the female burials were non-local, their chemical signatures tracing back to Ireland, Scotland, and the Slavic frontiers. Crucially, the skeletal evidence for these foreign women showed significantly higher rates of healed trauma, degenerative joint disease from excessive labor, and dietary deficiencies compared to their local Norse counterparts. One specific burial, catalogued as SK-117, was a woman from the Scottish Isles. Her spine showed compression fractures consistent with carrying heavy loads, and her teeth were worn down in a way that suggested a coarse, grit-filled diet. Yet she was buried with a valuable set of bronze trader's scales, a symbol of household authority. This is the paradox. She was granted status in death, but her body told a story of brutal servitude in life. She was a tool, used until she broke, and then discarded with the symbols of a station she was never truly allowed to hold. This systematic subjugation was not lawless, it was the law. The old Icelandic law code known as the Grágás, Grey Goose Laws, provides a chillingly bureaucratic window into the life of a thrall. A captive had no legal personhood. She could not own property. She could not testify at the Althing. Her children were born into her status, regardless of the father's rank. A Viking chieftain could father a child with a captive noblewoman, and that child would be born a slave, his property, like a calf born to his cattle. This legal framework was the essential architecture of dehumanization. It provided the moral and social justification for the horrors that were to follow. Stripped of legal protection, a captive was subject to the absolute will of her owner. The sagas occasionally mention a kind master freeing a loyal thrall, but the law codes tell a different story. They lay out the precise fines for injuring or killing someone else's thrall, a property crime, not a homicide. The penalty was paid to the owner, not the victim's family, because in the eyes of the law she had no family. Her kin were across the sea, their power meaningless in this new, brutal reality. Her past had been legally erased. With legal and personal identity destroyed, the next phase targeted the body itself. This was not about random violence. It was a calculated assault on a captive's sense of self and status. For a highborn woman whose life had been governed by strict codes of conduct and privacy, forced public humiliation was a potent weapon. Sagas and archaeological contexts suggest they were often made to perform the most degrading tasks. A Frankish countess, accustomed to servants, might be forced to muck out animal stalls or serve mead to the very warriors who had murdered her husband, all while wearing the coarse, undyed wool of a common slave. Clothing was a critical tool. In the Viking Age, what you wore signified who you were. To strip a noblewoman of her silk and linen, her embroidered gowns and gilded brooches, and force her into rags was to visually erase her status. Excavations of Viking-era textile workshops like those at Birka show a clear hierarchy of materials. The finest imported fabrics were reserved for the elite, while thralls wore rough, homespun cloth known as vadmal. For a captive, this forced change of attire was a daily, public declaration of her fall from grace, a constant reinforcement of her new, debased identity. The historical record, carved in stone, reinforces this erasure of identity. Across Scandinavia, hundreds of runestones commemorate the deeds of Viking chieftains. They boast of voyages, battles won, and wealth acquired. When captives are mentioned, it is almost always as a collective, a spoil of war. The Karlevi runestone on Erland speaks of a chieftain who ruled over a great retinue, but it does not name the unfree who formed the bulk of it. Consider the Björketorp runestone in Sweden, which carries a chilling curse. I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Incessantly plagued by maleficence, doomed to insidious death is he who breaks this monument. The curse protects the stone, the legacy of the man who raised it. The legacy of those he enslaved has no such protection. They are anonymous, their suffering subsumed into the victor's glory. If you find this exploration of runic mysteries and the stories they conceal compelling, ensure you subscribe and click the bell icon. There are many more stones left to turn. The absence of these women's names from the most permanent records of the age is not an accident. It is the entire point. They were to be remembered only as a testament to the power of the men who had unpersoned them. For captives from the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the final violation was spiritual. The conversion of Scandinavia was a slow, often violent process that stretched across centuries. Throughout the peak of the Viking Age, the Norse were defiantly pagan. For a captive Anglo-Saxon or Frankish woman, steeped in the rituals and rhythms of the church, being forced into this pagan world was an existential terror. She would be compelled to witness, and perhaps participate in, the blot, the central ritual of Norse paganism. This involved the sacrifice of animals, sometimes humans, to gods she considered demons. The blood of the sacrificed animal would be sprinkled over the participants and the walls of the hall using a h-lotting, a ritual twig bundle. Imagine the psychological torment for a devout Christian nun or noblewoman, forced to be spattered with the blood of a sacrifice to Odin or Freya. It was a calculated act of spiritual defilement, designed to sever her from her God and her community of faith. This was not an attempt at conversion. It was an act of damnation, the ultimate expression of power over a person's life, their body, and what they believed to be their eternal soul. The ultimate demand was the captive's life, not taken in the heat of battle, but as a ritual component in the death of her master. The phenomenon of retainer sacrifice is a grim reality in the archaeology of the Viking Age. The most famous ship burials, like the one unearthed at Oseberg in Norway, contained the bodies of more than one woman. The primary burial was a high-status queen or priestess. With her was an older woman, whose skeleton showed signs of a hard life. For years, she was assumed to be a loyal servant who chose to follow her mistress into the afterlife. But modern forensic analysis challenges this romantic notion. She may have been a captive, an unwilling participant in a macabre theatrical performance. The sagas are filled with references to thralls being sent with their masters. The Unglinga saga describes how a king's retainers were laid in his burial mound. For a captive, this was the final act of erasure. After a life of servitude, her death was not even her own. It was an accessory, a piece of grave furniture to service the needs of her owner in the next world. Her existence was reduced to a footnote in someone else's journey to Valhalla or Hell. The most vivid and terrifying account of this practice comes not from a saga, but from an outsider. In 922, the Arab diplomat Ahmed ibn Fadlan witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga River. His account is unflinching. When the chieftain died, his property was divided, and one of his slave girls volunteered to die with him. Ibn Fadlan's description makes it clear this was no choice. The girl was plied with strong drink, passed from tent to tent to be sexually violated by the chieftain's men, and then led to the funeral ship. There, an old woman known as the Angel of Death placed a cord around her neck, and as two men pulled it tight, repeatedly stabbed her between the ribs. Her body was then placed beside her master's on the pyre. Ibn Fadlan's account describes the girl being seemingly ecstatic, singing throughout the ordeal. Was this genuine religious fervor, or the result of drugs and extreme psychological conditioning? This was the ultimate demand. Not just a captive's body, not just her labor, not just her identity, but a willing, even joyful performance of her own ritualized murder. It was the complete and total consumption of one human being by another. But history has a strange way of preserving what was meant to be erased. While the individual identities of these captive women were systematically destroyed, their collective genetic legacy survived and flourished. Modern DNA studies of the Icelandic population have revealed a fascinating and telling imbalance. While the paternal lineage's Y chromosome are overwhelmingly Scandinavian, the maternal lineage's mitochondrial DNA show that as much as 60% of the founding female population came from the British Isles. These were not Norse women. They were the Irish, Scottish, and English captives brought to this new, barren land by Viking settlers. They were Melkorka and her countless, nameless sisters. Their stories were silenced, their names forgotten, and their culture suppressed. And yet they endured. They became the mothers of the Icelandic nation. This genetic echo is the ultimate, unintentional monument to their existence. It proves that despite the warlords' best efforts to unperson them, they could not be entirely erased. If you value documented history that uncovers the forgotten stories in our own DNA, support our work by subscribing to The Sealed Room. Their legacy is a quiet testament to a survival that defied one of history's most brutal systems of dehumanization. The memory of this practice eventually faded into folklore, sanitized for a new Christian age. The Sagas, written in the 13th century, transformed the brutal reality of the captive trade into romantic subplots. The enslaved Irish princess became a stock character, her suffering a mere obstacle on the hero's journey. But the trauma lingered in the cultural subconscious. Norse mythology itself is filled with powerful female figures, Valkyries, Norns, goddesses, who hold immense power. Some scholars have argued this is a faint echo, a cultural compensation for the systematic powerlessness of real women, especially captives in Viking society. The truth is that we are left with fragments, a deviant burial in Orkney, a passage in an Arab traveler's journal, a puzzling genetic signature, a whisper in a heroic saga. Assembling these pieces reveals a picture of a system far more complex and terrifying than simple raiding and pillaging. It was a sustained, multi-generational project of conquest that targeted not just land and wealth, but the very identity of the conquered. The warlords demanded oblivion for their captives, and they nearly succeeded. We return to the woman in the Orkney bog. The broken Carolingian brooch buried with her tells us who she was before she was captured, a woman of wealth and status from one of the most powerful empires in Europe. The isotopes in her teeth tell us where she was from. Her bones, scarred by labor and malnutrition, tell us how she lived after her capture. Her face-down burial, pinned by stones, tells us how she was feared, even in death. What it can never tell us is her name. This is the final victory of her captors. The demand was not just for her service, her body, or even her life. The ultimate demand was for her name, her story, her memory. They demanded that she be forgotten, reduced to a nameless ghost in a foreign land. And for 1,000 years she was. But now, through the meticulous work of forensic science, she is beginning to speak again. Her bones are a testament, a final act of resistance against the oblivion that was demanded of her. She and the thousands like her are the silent matriarchs of the Viking Age, their stories written not in runes, but in the permanent, unyielding language of the cold earth.